This is a story about a meeting with the woman who will become my future wife. I'm in a marriage with the mother of my child, who I had met when I was at Harvard.
Can you use names and dates?
Anita Bullard, whom I married, who I met, who's in Barnard Hall at Harvard Radcliffe, taken over there by a friend of mine, John Nelson. Anita was dazzling red hair, as did both of her parents, and somehow I'd always been attracted to redheads. I'd had redheaded friends when I was a much younger child. I mean, 9 or 10, and about 3 of them. And I mean, chums. Charles Smith, who I called Chubby Smith, who was a terrific football player and athlete, and went to McCauley Military Academy in Chattanooga. It was the private school we went to, and this was before I went to Lawrenceville School, and we had played on a kind of minor league boys football team, on which was were other good athletes, especially Robert Overholt, and both Charles Smith and Robert Overholt, who later became a physician and specializing in allergies. Both of them got football scholarships to the University of Tennessee, which was in its sort of heyday as a football team, later to win the national championship. And I think about the time I was in junior high school, they went to the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans. They lost their game. I went to that. I always went to the games. We had box seats. And Tennessee has some dazzling players, such as Hank Larsella from New Orleans, and others. I mean, they were a great football team, coached by General Neyland. And I mean, they'd had people who played for the Chicago Bears. I can't remember all the names. Football was a great industry at the University of Tennessee. It made a lot of money for the university, which had been a land grant university, sort of, the time when grants were given to agricultural colleges. And they had a great school of agriculture with a university farm across from our house, across the Tennessee, on the other side of the Tennessee River. And it was, sort of the lab, like the lab farm, and beautiful peach orchard over there, which would bloom in May, April and May, and beautiful fields, livestock. I started talking about being in a bad marriage. I don't know. Anita's great all A's and many shared interests with me about literature and music. somehow, I mean, I was pathologically jealous of her first boyfriends with whom she'd been intimate. And I said in another piece maybe that talked about my father's offer for me to come and talk to me about anything that was bothering me that I wasn't able to talk to anybody else about. I said I should have talked to him about this difficulty in my marriage. Maybe he would have talked me out of going ahead with it. And really, I think, although if it had meant not having our son, I wouldn't have paid that price. But I should really have married a virgin. And because I had very sick feelings about the fact that I had not been her first lover. I mean, we had a very good erotic relationship in a lot of ways, but because of my paranoid suspect to my manhood about these other young men who had been her first lovers. It was very sick, very malignant. I also was always looking for somebody. I mean, I'm always looking at other women who I thought were maybe prettier, more attractive than she was. I didn't realize at the time that she was going to run off with her Shakespeare professor, visiting professor from England, Frank Kermode, at Rutgers University, where she was getting her PhD in a summer course. He had told the person I'm talking about at the moment, we're going to talk about shortly, Patricia Goodhart. Frank Kermode had told Pat and her husband, Jean Goodhart, who had stayed in the Kermode's house in Dulwich, England, rented it when they were in Paris. He was on a Fulbright and maybe a Guggenheim grant, Jean, her husband. And Frank told Pat that Anita was the best student she ever had. So on the telephone, Pat told Anita that when after they met at this incident I'm going to soon speak about, I had gone to Chicago to take over my grandfather's business, the Spring Packing Corporation, which my Uncle Jack had been running and using as a kind of umbrella for a business he was trying to start of his own, which was later called Landreth Industries. He was using the plant and not paying for it, but I mean the rents would have added up to $70,000. It was like just taking it away from my mother and me. I thought it was unfair to my mother, and when our lawyer confronted him, I backed up of the story that our lawyer, Steve Mitchell, was told. And because of that, my Uncle Jack resigned and started his own business, which he called Landreth Industries. And he was going to be making fiberglass panels for railroad refrigerated cars, which sometimes got filthy from the fruit and rotten fruit and so on that got splattered on the sides of the refrigerated car. And he was the greatest salesman in the railway supply business. He was really Mr. Railway Supply. He had the gift. He was elegant, handsome, a sportsman, a great golfer. He had a stable of racehorses, and he gave all his customers uh, access to his box seats at the racetracks around Lake Forest, around Chicago, on Wednesday. Or that was a golf course. All the other racetracks. Anyway, and also gave the top brass of the Santa Fe Railroad, which was his biggest customer, box seats. The chief engineer, his name was Bickle. His son used our factory when I was working there one summer to make a fiberglass boat for himself. And then later, Tom Bickle, when my uncle was doing well with his business, had been offered $13 million for it, turned them down. He built a new plant so he could deliver faster, and he wasn't getting orders that stopped coming in because the railroads had, all the major railroads had supplied for that season, and until they needed to re-equip, they wouldn't order again. So with the expenses for the new factory and no revenues, no orders to ship out and collect on, he was in trouble. He had creditors. And Tom Bickle went to them and was paid to make a deal so they could offer him practically nothing for the business. His father found out about it. He was chief engineer of Santa Fe Railroad, and his father committed suicide. It was a great shame to him. It seemed like an extreme response, but it happened. And the next thing you know, his wife, he was having trouble with alcohol. He joined AA again, stopped drinking. His wife, Betty, they had 3 children. She had 2 adopted children from her former marriage. Betty Wright, her father, had been a doctor in Peoria, in Illinois. Her ex-husband's name was Stevens. He used to come and try to see the kids when I was staying at their house, and quite pitiful. Anyway, Betty, on a tip from George Landris, who had started Elcor chemical, petrochemical company in Texas. It had gone on the stock exchange for $4. She bought in low, and it went up to 69. She sold out, made $950,000, almost $1 million, and she moved to New York, divorced my uncle, and started a new life with her children and stepchildren, and one of whom was married. Diana had married the heir of the Pullman car fortune, who was a Yale graduate and writing plays. Diana was her name. Diana, she took my uncle's last name, my middle name, Landris, Diana Landris. She ended up marrying Arthur Archel of Goldman and Sachs and the Lehman fortune. And they were also related to the Goodharts of Philadelphia, which was actually Gene Goodhart's family. And anyway, here I was in Chicago with my son Davy, who was 3, and having worked at MIT in the instrumentation laboratory before I went to take over the family business as the only member of the family on the job. We were invited to a party which had been arranged by my philosophy tutor at Harvard, Marshall Cohen, who would then become my advisor. I was not doing well in philosophy and obviously not cut out to be a professional philosopher. Marshall was very, very encouraged when I made all A's, 3 consecutive semesters. And so when I let him know I was in Chicago, he'd been hired at the University of Chicago in philosophy, not having gotten tenure at Harvard. So it was just had been formed the Committee on Social Thought with Hannah Arendt, Hannah Green, and Saul Bellow. Also in that Committee on Social Thought, which had a rigorous reading list, all the Founding Fathers' works on the Federalist Papers was one of the main texts on the reading list of students in those seminars. And Edward Shultz was a sociologist on the Social Committee. Marshall had arranged a party which included Hannah Arendt, Saul Bellow, Jean Goodhart, and Pat Goodhart. And when I saw Pat, it's the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life. Basically, my heart was in my throat. I couldn't talk hardly. I mean, I've never been so bowled over by a woman my age. This is 1963. And it was Marshall's idea that Anita and Pat would become friends because they had literary interests. Pat had started to write her fiction, and she was about to go off to Columbia to do a master's degree with Irma Brandeis as had been her tutor at Bard College. And she would do her master's degree with people like Marjorie Nicholson and the great literary critic at Columbia at that time, being her advisor was Edward Taylor on the 17th century Renaissance poetry. Also, the great teacher there in seminars had written about Arnold, and was later to write about Jim Forster. I can't recall his name. It'll come to me later. Excuse me, but this is a very, very exciting moment to meet some of the giants in the intellectual world at this party. I mean, I asked Saul Bellow what he was doing in the Committee on Social Thought. He said, I'm trying to set people against each other. You know, he didn't really take serious questions seriously. Edward Shultz was very interesting. I think I talked to him for a minute, and I also became a very close friend of his brother, who was the chief engineer at the General Car Manufacturing Company, GATX, that made boxcars and freight cars. for the railroads. And I had a fiberglass hatch cover, which I was ready to go into production on. I had a manufacturer up in Minneapolis that actually made silos out of fiberglass. And I've gone up there and gotten, but I actually had a test. I had a fiberglass hatch cover made up to put out on a boxcar, on a hopper car, to test it. And through Lee Schill's brother, who was the chief engineer at GATX, I got it put on the car, and so that it could be slammed closed and show that it would, not get warped or anything, and stand up against any kind of contact with chemicals and all other conditions that made sometimes difficulties for the steel hatch covers that the railroad was using. And this, I went out, I remember it was like 14 feet high. I climbed up the side of the boxcar and then walked down the top of the boxcar, the hopper car, and, lifted the cover on its hinges, slammed it down, it looked fine, no signs of any kind of deterioration. And then the next thing I knew, I figured if I knew how many they ordered a year, that I might make $80,000 a year on this one product. And then I got word from Lee Schills that they could make it cheaper for steel, so they weren't going to use my product. It was a huge, crushing blow. Great disappointment. I mean, you start counting your chickens before they hatch, and having fantasies of living that life of Riley with all the money you need and able to do all sorts of things that I wouldn't have been able to do before. I lived rather sparsely and frugally with my young family, Anita and Davy. We lived in Old Town on Menominee Street and had a beautiful apartment we rented from an Irish woman, Mrs. Dooley, and her husband on Sedgwick Street, the corner of Sedgwick Street in Menominee, in what was called Old Town, near north of Chicago, near Lincoln Park. And it was an absolutely beautiful neighborhood, which we loved. And near Wells Street, which was where there were a lot of entertainment and interesting places, bars and eating places. Great great grocery store right around the corner from us. We used to wheel Davy down there, and Anita and I had a great time there. Her friend Jessie Benton, who was becoming a folk singer, similar to Joan Baez, whom we also knew. Jessie was the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, and I had found out she was in my freshman class at Harvard, gone over and called her up and taken her out to dinner. So excited. She was a really pretty girl, really sexy, beautiful, really knockout. She later was in a folk singing commune called The Family. They lived on the top of Fort Hill. And there was a guru named Mel Lyman, who was a sinister character, a malicious, sort of dangerous character, tried to turn all these women on LSD in order to get them in bed. And then he actually introduced Anita to LSD. I was furious with her for taking LSD and or acid, as they used to call it. So anyway, here I was having trouble in my marriage with Anita. She, on the verge, having to take all this paranoid jealousy, pathological jealousy for me, about various people. Charlotte Embarger, Arthur Gillette, others. And she had been engaged to Rocky Whitman from Maryland, and who'd gone off to join the army and become a paratrooper. And then, as soon as we were married, I get a call from him saying, "You've stolen my fiance from me. You wanted to come over and meet me." And I don't know what he imagined he could accomplish by that. I mean, so what was he going to do? Just talk about their sex life or what? To tell me something to make me upset me about her more? I said I had no interest in talking to him. Why was I in any way obliged to him to see him? I refused to have him visit me at our place on 1445 Cambridge Street, around the corner from Rosie's restaurant, and what would later become Legal Seafood, the Berkowitz's first fish store opened, and S&S Delicatessen, where Pat and I now eat often. Wonderful delicatessen and breakfast place, wonderful food of all sorts, and near our place now at 50 Amory Street in Cambridge. Very easy walk from our duplex. Anyway, I had no idea when I was first set eyes on Pat and just was bowled over by her beauty. I mean, speechless, really. I could hardly say anything to her. I was sort of tongue-tied with my heart, my throat. I mean, she was just really the most gorgeous woman I've ever seen in my life. And I think any pictures of her at that time would convince anybody that wasn't an exaggeration. She was wearing a beautiful dress her mother had bought her, and she had platinum blonde hair and blue eyes, beautiful skin. I mean, everything about her was just absolutely flabbergastingly beautiful. And you know, Anita and Pat, I think, did some things together, like go to Marshall Fields together to have lunch. And we actually had Gene over when Pat was away at Columbia, and it was a terrible evening. You know, he'd had no respect for us. He was a real climber in the a careerist, working his way up. Now, first of all, with his job, Pat had married her professor, English professor. He was a graduate of Columbia, got his PhD there. Lionel Trilling is the person I'm thinking of, with whom Pat studied when she got her did her master's work at Columbia, with Trilling and Arthur Nicholson and Moses Haddis and others. Gene came to dinner at Sedgwick Street at our grand apartment, which was beautifully furnished. High ceilings, 12-foot ceilings, kind of Victorian style building, wonderful building with a garden and a great porch in the back. At this party, we met people who were really flabbergasted. Saul Bellow was come back to Chicago, which is the place he'd grown up, and figured in his novels with his wife Susan, who'd been a friend of Pat's, Susan Glassman, who was a graduate of Wellesley College. And my friend Bob Garris had been in love with her, but I think got nowhere with her. Saul married her, brought her back to Chicago to take this great job at University of Chicago, Committee on Social Thought. And he was, Pat and Gene used to listen to him read Herzog, after the chapters were finished at Bard. Invite him over to dinner almost every night. In Chicago, they spent a lot of time with him. And in fact, Saul sort of did things like, what are we wasting our time with these guys? And speaking of his wife Susan and her, and about to Pat referring to Gene, and making a kind of suggestion that something should happen between them. And of course, Pat wasn't interested in that. I mean, she thought he was fantastic, man. He has a great sense of humor, wonderful looking man. At that time, when he was young, before he became older. And he's the greatest novelist in America at the time. I mean, there was Ralph Ellison, who had been at Bard, the underground man. There were other terrific writers, like Flannery O'Connor. Faulkner wasn't dead yet. And there would be fiction writers to come, the whole innovative thing, John Barth and people like that. Pynchon, many other great writers. At that time, when Saul was publishing with Viking, anyway, Gene came over and he was, I just could hardly say anything to him. He was rather condescending. And, I didn't even want to talk about my writing. I mean, we once went to dinner, Anita and I went to dinner at Pat and Gene's, and they invited Richard Stern, who was a good writer, and very full of himself, talking all the time. I was rather shy and not really full of myself as some of these people were. It was uphill making conversation around it. And I don't know if they respected me just because I'd gone to Harvard and was doing some writing of my own. My first working on my first novella, with which I used as in place of a master's thesis at UConn. I never got published because my agent, Perry Knowlton at Curtis Brown, tried with every major magazine, Esquire, Atlantic, New Yorker. They were all interested, but they said it was too short for a novel. The book publishers, the magazines said it was too long. It would have been the beginning of a really great writing career if, let's say, the New Yorker had taken it. And Knowlton got very close with it in that case. I remember when I sent it off from LA, I was at Cyrano's restaurant, and the great black writer who wrote Tell It on the Mountain, Baldwin, they wrote was in the restaurant, and I held up the parcel, the envelope holding my manuscript of the. It was called Sister then. It was 110 pages. I said that my novel, I was sending it off to New York. He said, "I'll say a prayer for you." A wonderful moment. And it was a great time in LA. I mean, all some of the members of the bands from England, like Rolling Stones, were in town with their mod costumes and high shoes with high heels and great trousers that flared, and all sorts of wonderful clothes and costumes, some of which I bought. I bought some new clothes down there. I was making a movie with my sister at that point, and then when I went to get my master's degree at UConn, I actually came with that movie and showed it, and this wonderful woman, Marilyn Bro, later published a book about Sylvia Plath, as I've said, and became a professor at Grinnell in English. Everybody at UConn was very impressed with it. And after I showed the movie and also did a night at the University of Tennessee, a favorite underground films of mine, they started a whole film program there because of me. And I was also making an underground film with this camera that had been used to take the footage of my parents' marriage in their garden in Evanston at my grandparents' house on Sheridan Road before they went off to France so Daddy could study with Maurice right before he took the job in the Chicago Orchestra and learned to be a symphony conductor. The same camera, this Kodak 16 millimeter camera that you wound up with a key and no sound, was making these silent films. One was called Tennessee Newsreels, and mostly about Anita and some other footage in color. It's a wall photograph, but if I'd had a really great camera like an Arriflex or a Bolex, it would have been a lot better. And it would have been a lot better with sound. Right before Anita took off to make her go to England to Paris, and then go over to England for an assignation with Frank Kermode, and that's the way I lost her. She abandoned me and Davy, and finally, after getting my MA at UConn, and Mary Lynn went off to teach at Notre Dame, I went back to Boston and took as a special student at the Divinity School. I was thinking of being an Episcopalian minister, but after seeing about bishops and the Bishop of Los Angeles and the Bishop of Tennessee, who because I was divorced by this time or separated from my wife, they were not interested in me becoming what was called a postulant, and no ordination in the Episcopal Church was possible at that point. I moved back to Boston, to Cambridge, where most of my friends were, and my great friends, my teacher, William Alford, at Harvard, and around the corner, I found out was living Pat and Jean Goodhart, and that's where we began seeing a lot of Pat, and it wasn't, and being invited to parties and lunches at her house, and lots of children, Eric and Jessica. I think Eric was 6 and Jessica was only 4 or 5. When I met her for the first time, my stepdaughter now was also a poet. And before we knew it, we were falling in love. So this is how it all started. And I replaced the loss of my wife, Anita, and had the good fortune of meeting the greatest woman I've ever known in my life. One the most beautiful, and it's a great passion, our love. We've had 4 children. She'd had 2 before we were married with Jean, Eric, and Jessica. And then we have now Davy, Nicholas, Eric, and Jessica, and now grandchildren, Maximilian, Jessica's boy, with John Medeiros, and Eric has a beautiful son, Alex, with his wife, Alia, and we're very happy with our family. It's been my whole life, the joy of my life. As I told Nicholas the other day, the most joyful day of my life was the day he was born. I was there, natural childbirth, Beth Israel Hospital, and there's nothing like this. I mean, I have 2 great sons I'm proud of, and our life in Newton was wonderful, and our summers in Maine, where we had a house on an island, Vinyl Penobscot Bay. Spent all our summers there, and then finally started traveling to Europe. A year in '84 in Paris, and then finally a return to buy a great piece of land in Normandy, and then sold that for great profit, and then bought this magnificent place where I am at this very moment. You can see it as I speak behind me. This magnificent room, this salon, which is enough. I gave a piano recital with our back son. 57 people were here. A great place to give parties. The views out the back of this house, even out of the kitchen window. The most beautiful view in all of this part of Normandy. Lower Normandy, it's called. Or the Pays Bas, or Pays d'Auge. It's got a great garden full of roses and all sorts of other flowers, fruit trees, apple and pear, and we're on the edge of a ridge, and it goes down to fields where cows and horses are, and we can see for like 20 kilometers, ridge after ridge. I mean, it's just extraordinary. I've done paintings of it, and garden full of roses, and all sorts of other flowers, and we have big chestnut tree in front, not the edible kind, and along the edge of the steep hill that goes down to the field below are linden trees, huge, ancient linden trees, about 3 feet in diameter, and it's a great privilege to live here. We're across from a 13th century church, the Church of Saint Michel, and or St. Michael's. This is the presbyter where the priest lived and died when we bought it from his family. And very, very happy here. I've been very productive here with my drawing and painting. And Nicholas particularly has been productive in drawing. I'm very happy to have spoken about the great fortune of meeting Patricia Summer, who was at that time Pat Goodhart, published under that name of Pat Goodhart, her married name. And I think I've told my story. Thank you.